Welcome, everyone, to the launch of Cost of Crisis, Economic and Non-Economic Loss and Damage from Climate Conflict and Socioeconomic Vulnerabilities in Mali. Sincere thank you to everyone for joining us today, whether online or in person. It's a privilege to bring together such a diverse group of policymakers, researchers, practitioners, and other representatives to discuss this urgent and complex issue. With that, I'll now hand over to Mattias Söderberg, uh, Global Climate Lead, DanChurchAid, for the opening and welcome remarks. Mattias, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and I hope you can hear me well. Perfect. I am so honored and happy to be able to welcome you all to this important webinar. I do this on behalf of IIED, TASAGAT, DanChurchAid, and All Act, and we are so happy to see so many people here. This is something we've been looking forward to. During this webinar, we will present the new report, which is being launched right now, Addressing Climate and Conflict-Related Loss and Damage in Fragile States, a focus on Mali. This report builds on the work done through a project in Mali, and it was actually funded by Denmark, Danida. As you may know, Denmark was the first government or country allocating funds for loss and damage, and this was part of the first allocation of funding for loss and damage. So we're very happy for that support. During this webinar, we will have, as I said, the presentation of the research findings. And then we will have a possibility to have a panel debate with some distinguished speakers. We call it Bridging Global and Local Action, where we will get some views. But there will also be possibility for Q&As and discussions with all of us on the call. And then, of course, we will also have a closing remark and a possibility to look at the next steps, how to move forward. And one of the things we really want to do when we move forward is to look at the fund for addressing loss and damage. We are so happy we have this fund, and of course, it also needs to start to deliver as soon as possible. And there is an upcoming board meeting in the fund, and we hope that the experiences from this research will be fed into that to the board meeting and to make sure they also learn from the experiences from Mali. I would also like to stress that this research is an example of how we really can link the experiences from the ground with the global debates. And I think this is also in itself an important element. Political decisions, political debates, they should not be based just on what people or governments think. It should be based on experiences from the ground and what's happening, and experiences from people and communities who actually are affected by climate change. And I'm therefore very happy to open this webinar, and I look forward to listen to all the speakers. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Mattias, for your opening remark, and you've already set the stage. So good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, because I see someone put in the chat message that they've joined from a place which is like 10 p.m. in the night. So we really value your participation. I'm Ritu Bharadwaj. I'm the Director, Climate Resilience, Finance, and Loss and Damage at IIED. We also have an initiative called All Act, so Alliance for Locally Led Transformative Action on Loss and Damage. And we are very pleased that we worked alongside DanChurchAid and TASAGAT. And as Mattias said, this is the kind of partnership we want to really bring that grounded evidence and try to influence not just the national level policies and programs, but also international climate finance, and make sure that that urgency of the kind of fund that is needed in these areas are understood, and we are able to make some difference. So thank you so much, Mattias, for building or setting that stage for that. As Mattias said, today we are also launching this paper, which is like a joint initiative or joint effort of 3 organizations. We have worked over 1 year to collect all the data, evidence, and bring this to you. And before I start actually sharing what we found from the ground, it is important that I give you a little bit of context. Why Mali? And why Mali? Because Mali is one of the fragile and conflict-affected states. And if you can see on the graph there, the green dots that you see there are the FCAS countries, and fragile and conflict-affected states themselves. Many of them are least developed country, but if you compare their multidimensional vulnerability that they face, it's almost 40% higher than those of LDCs, which are not FCAS, and about 80% higher than other developing countries. So that is quite a thing. And some of the reasons why the situation is like this, because close to 155 million people who are acutely malnourished and hungry and who need urgent support, almost 2/3 of them reside in FCAS countries. Almost half of the global population, which are poor, also are in FCAS countries. And this is quite a number compared to only 10% of the global population actually are in FCAS. So compared to that, half of them being there is really a depressing figure. And this is expected to increase to 2/3 by 2030. So urgent action is needed now. But more than that, what we need to understand is the climate impact, which is acting as a stress multiplier on top of all the other conflict and other crises that these areas already face. And if you look at the vulnerability index, climate vulnerability index, almost 35 of the most climate vulnerable countries are also FCAS. So it is a compounding impact. And one of the immediate impact that we see in most of the areas is forced displacement and distress migration, which is quite evident, and it's only increasing over the years. So in order to understand the extent to which climate and conflict are driving distress migration and displacement, both the paper as well as this presentation today would be divided into 3 parts. So first, trying to understand that, then trying to understand what are the full range of both economic and non-economic loss and damage being experienced by these communities. Because you have to understand, like, quite often there's a lot of invisible impact that these communities face, but because we are not able to quantify them, quite often they do not get captured into the way government planning or national planning or social protection delivery is being designed. And therefore, we need to quantify these impacts as well. So we have tried to do that, and we'll present that as well. And then finally, we'll also talk about what would solution look like in these areas and what kind of support would be needed, both from the national government, but also from the international community. So starting, where did we carry out this research? Of course, we did this research in Mali. But the area that we picked up for research was Mopti, one of the most climate vulnerable region in the country, exposed to not just drought, but also floods. And within this study area, we covered about 22 villages, covering 5 communes. More details about all of this you can find in the paper. I'm sure Martin has shared the link to that. Now, let's look at the climate impact, how it has increased. So if you look at before 1990, the average frequency of disasters in Mali as a whole was 0.57, which is increased to close to 1.32, which is like almost 2.5 times what it was before 1990. So clearly frequency has increased. But what has happened is because of the low adaptive capacity, on an average, we also projected what would be the so a climate impact becomes a disaster when the number of affected people and number of deaths go up beyond a certain threshold. And this is expected to increase to 60,000 deaths per year and about 3 million people getting impacted by disasters as we move forward to 2034, if the same level of adaptive capacity is maintained, if we don't do anything about it. The second is we also tried to look at how the frequency of these disasters have increased in Mopti region. And you can see both droughts as well as floods have increased in the last 3 decades. Droughts have increased almost by 1.7 times from what it was 3 decades ago now. Again, so typically one would say, how is the migration or displacement increase? Now, from and these are based on the testimonies of the people themselves and not from a secondary sources of data, is close to only 4% of the people, households used to migrate about 10 years ago, which has now increased to 68%. 70%. And of these migrants, where do people typically go? About 70% of them go to other regions within the country, and about 40% move to other countries. And what are the reasons for undertaking? So we try to work out or find out the reasons for undertaking both distress migration separately and displacement. So in case of distress migration, the primary reason quoted by people was financial and food crisis being faced by the community because of drought, and conflict came as a second reason for driving distress migration. In case of displacement, climate was not the primary reason. In case of displacement, the primary reason came out to be conflict, followed by food and financial crisis caused because of drought. So we also wanted to look at, even though while these are the trends, what type of households really migrate and who do not migrate, and why some families undertake migration and others do not. So for this, we used a framework we call it 3P, but we want to, because we know that climate impact does not happen in isolation. It happens on top of other vulnerabilities that are already existing in those areas. So development deficits are there. So when climate impacts acts as a stress multiplier, what is it acting as a stress multiplier on? And that has a big impact on who becomes more vulnerable compared to others. So in this case, we used 3 P factors. In predisposing factors, we developed something called inherent resilience index. In precipitating factors, we looked at 2 precipitating factors because we knew that climate was not the only factor. Conflict was as well. So for climate, we looked at climate risk index, and for conflict, we developed something called internal conflict risk index. And for protective factors, we looked at social protection programs that are currently there in these communities. And in all, this is how the framing of these factors look like. So on the predisposing factor, we looked at economic, political, social, and demographic drivers. On conflict, again, we looked at a couple of factors. And then we worked out how all of these factors together lead to multidimensional vulnerability, especially in the presence or absence of social protection program, which impacts the ability to cope or recover from a climatic impact. And then to understand to the extent to which it is leading to losses and damages within the community. Now, let's look at what the results showed. So in terms of results, let's first look at the predisposing factors. Now, in case of predisposing factors, these are some of the factors that we considered to develop this index. So in terms of food consumption score, educational status of the household, family head, and so on. Now, I'm not going to present the data of all of them. Of course, you're going to find all of these data in great detail in the paper, but just to give a snapshot of what some of these figures looked like, just to explain the trend to you. So our sample was non-migrants, migrants, and displaced families. And you will see that the food consumption score, you have to understand this score in terms of 100. So the non-migrants and migrants are quite close to each other, and displaced is the worst off. But even these families, if you consider them on the overall index value, they're not very, even those who we consider well off or better off than others, even they are not quite good enough in terms of their food consumption score. Now, the percentage of families which are headed by women, the maximum 17% was in the case of displaced families. And this was mostly families where the male member had died because of conflict and other situations. Now, in terms of education status, you will again see the level of illiteracy is quite high in the case of displaced families. Of course, the illiteracy level is quite high in other groups as well, but it's more pronounced in case of displaced. Similarly, if you look at the percentage of households owning agricultural land, again, in case of displaced households, it's much more pronounced compared to non-migrants. Non-migrants have the highest landhold percentage. Then average household earning of both non-migrants as well as migrants is quite similar, whereas in case of displaced families, it's almost 30% less than those of other two groups of families. And this is interesting because it shows you the composition of household income. So in case of displaced household, you will see majority of them, they're either agriculture-based or livestock-based livelihood, whereas in the case of migrant, you will see as it is, they're already 30% of their household income is dependent on remittance. So if they don't migrate, like their household income will go down dramatically. But in case of non-migrant, one of the reasons why they are still don't have to undertake distress migration is probably because a lot of them are salaried communities, so they have a stable source of income at their end. So like I didn't show you the data of all the factors, but then if you combine all of those factors, then we worked out the inherent resilience index. Again, this is on the scale of 100, so higher the value, better resilience it displays for those households, which in the case of displaced families, you will see that the resilience is far less compared to those of non-migrants and migrants. Then we looked at the precipitating factor as well, which was climate first. So if you look at climate, we considered all of these indicators. I'm not going to read them out to you, but probably you can check them out in the paper. But when we combine all of those factors, this is the kind of climate risk index that came out. You can say clearly that the non-migrants are the least exposed to climate risk compared to those of displaced. And you can understand this value on the basis of higher the index value, higher is the risk. Then we also worked out something called based on the conflict, because we knew that it's not just the climate, but also climate conflict plays a precipitating role or stress multiplier for the communities. So we needed to understand to what extent both of these factors individually and combined drive distress migration and forced displacement. Now, in case of working out internal conflict risk index, we looked at these two indicators. I've kept the data for both of these just to explain to you, sometimes figures can be misleading. So if you look at non-migrant household is the least exposed to serious injuries in the last 3 years compared to displaced. And then if you look at the reasons for this injury, the conflict activities is very high and like it's almost 60% in case of both migrants and displaced. And in case of death in the family, you will see both non-migrants and migrant and displaced families are quite close to each other. But if you look at the reasons for the death, it's close to 60% is in the case of displaced families is because of conflict activities. Whereas in the case of non-migrant, the deaths were high, but it's mostly because of disease and other factors and not because of conflict. Now, and then we used all of that value to again work out the internal conflict risk index, which again was much more pronounced in the case of displaced families. We also looked at the protective factor because lack of protective factor is what makes a household more vulnerable to being exposed. And we looked at a number of social protection programs or coverage that is currently available to the communities. We looked at all of these. I'm not going to read them out, but just to mention that compared to some of the other country contexts that people may have seen, in case of Mali, and many other fragile and conflict-affected states, the social protection programs are not just run by government. There are a lot of NGO-run social protection program as well. Now, I'm going to show you the figure. So this is the social protection index for different categories of households. And why I kept this 100 value here is to explain to you this is the range. And out of that, that's the level of social protection available to them. This is really, really small. So it is almost inconsequential. It does not provide them any safety net in the time of crisis, either conflict or climate. So then based on this, we worked out why some households migrate, some do not, and what are the factors that really contribute to the migration, because it is important. And, time and again, a lot of people keep asking, to what extent is climate driving migration? To what extent conflict is driving migration? So we had to work out two regression model. One regression model was to understand the drivers of migration, and the other was drivers of distress migration, I should say, and the other was drivers of displacement. Now, in case of distress migration, we did not find, like, the only factor which was found to be statistically significant or important was climate risk. So only families which were exposed to climate risks had higher chances of undertaking migration. But in the case of displacement, we found that all the three factors, inherent resilience index, climate risk index, conflict risk index, all the three factors were responsible for driving displacement. So households which were experiencing fewer climate risks were 2.3 times less likely to be displaced and 1.5 times less likely to migrate. And in the same way, households which faced less violence or insecurity were 3 times less likely to be displaced. And in case of displacement, we saw that inherent resilience. So lower the resilience, lower chances of the family migrating or undertaking displacement, which was like close to 5.09 times. Now, so this helped us understand what are so causality of climate or conflict driving migration and displacement. But we also needed to understand, like, when people are exposed to these combined multidimensional risks, what is the kind of economic and non-economic loss and damage it creates on the migrants and displaced families and even non-migrants. So we have developed a toolkit called CSIC. It's called Comprehensive Climate Impact Quantification Toolkit, where, as I said, we do a lot of participatory appraisal with the community. We then collect the information, try to work out the 3P, predisposing, precipitating, and protective factor, which I've already explained to you. And then we try to categorize and quantify the economic and non-economic loss and damage, and then work out solutions. So, like, if I, of course, this is quite a dense slide, but I nevertheless kept it because I wanted to explain how, like, what did we really do in this initiative. So we have already explained what the precipitating factors were, what the predisposing factor were, and what the status of the protective factor was, which helps us understand the level of vulnerability to which a community is exposed to. But then, based on that, we then work out what are the economic and non-economic loss and damage a community is facing, in order for us to then work out what kind of support, relief, and rehabilitation mechanisms are needed at micro, meso, and macro level in order to develop that absorptive capacity within the community to deal with these crises, adaptive capacity so that they can bounce back from that crisis as well, and then transformative capacity so that they can go beyond that vulnerability threshold of being exposed to that crisis again and again. So this is in all. So we started off with this premise. And then we have already explained to you where we were in terms of identifying the 3P and the factors driving it. But then we also worked out the range of economic and non-economic loss and damage it is creating on community. So using this, so, it is based on tangibility because spectrum, because not all impacts are tangible. Of course, tangible impacts in terms of loss of assets, loss of crop, livestock, and so on. But that tangible impact quite often leads to intangible impact, for example, creating mental health impact, anxiety, stress, and so on. And similarly, we have a value spectrum where we try to find out the functional and intrinsic value. Functional, things like forced labor or being exposed to exploitative labor, modern slavery, or food insecurity can impact a person's ability to work effectively. That impacts its functions. So functional value. And intrinsic value is something that communities or households, it does not have a practical value for other people, but it has a very deep value for that individual themselves. For example, loss of cultural heritage, their self-being, self-worth. So a lot of these factors are quite often not considered, but they have a profound impact on a household, and therefore we needed to understand. We also look at temporality and spatiality, because we know that when communities move, they move from their source to destination. So there's a spatial angle in there. And also temporality, because a lot of these impacts have happened in the past, they are currently happening, and they'll continue in the future. So when we are trying to quantify the economic and non-economic loss and damage, we'll have to consider all of that aspect there. So based on those 6 quadrants that I showed earlier, we worked out these broader category of impacts. For example, loss of biodiversity, land degradation, loss of income, health, drudgery. And then we place them in different quadrant of tangible, intangible, intrinsic, and functional to work it out. So if you look at this figure here, we worked out the tangible functional loss and damage index based on these sub-indexes. For example, loss of income index, loss of income due to displacement, biodiversity loss, land degradation index, and so on. And these were the indicators that we used within them. Why I'm taking you through this is because probably this is the first time we have tried to quantify both the economic and non-economic loss and damage in an FCAS context. And I want people to understand the dynamics behind it. So it becomes clearer for people to understand when they look at the final data. So I'm not going to show, of course, you have an interest, you can read through the paper in full, but just to show you a snapshot of some of these figures that came out. For example, flood-related crop loss or drought-related crop loss for different categories of households. Similarly, livestock loss or employment loss or reduction in land holding of displaced families. You can see that the displaced families had much greater land holding before when they were at their source villages and where they are in their displaced location. And similarly, a reduction in the average number of animals or livestock that they owned before and after displacement. Similarly, how the household's annual income of the displaced households came down, or reasons for biodiversity loss. We also worked out the land degradation univariate indexes as to what were the factors contributing to land degradation, like decline in soil fertility, organic matter, and so on. Similarly, reasons for land degradation. Okay. So I think we've gone a couple of, so land degradation. And then based on all of that, we then worked out the composite index for displaced families, as you see, migrant families and non-migrants. So we'll see that each of these values have been quantified for each category of households, from displaced, non-migrants as well as migrants, for each of those categories. Now, I'm not going to take you through all of them for all indicators, but just to explain to you that we also worked out intangible functional loss and damage based on forced labor index, poor living conditions, or harassment index, food security index. And then based on that, each of these factors, we worked out what each of these indexes would look like. We also looked at some of the tangible intrinsic loss and damage, for example, serious injuries, loss of life, loss of assets, and worked out the values for them. And then something that is typically not considered in many of the policy framing or programmatic framing is like things that are non-economic in nature, for example, loss of cultural identity, mental health problem index, and so on. And just to explain, like it was not easy for us also to work out, but then, things that we typically considered were, for example, difficulty in concentration, fatigue, sense of isolation, increase in crying spell. So a lot of these things we had to understand from the community and then try to quantify them. And then based on that, we did an overall quantification. Now, I'm sorry for taking you through all of that quickly. If you have an interest, you can always read through the report and understand how they have been quantified. But I really wanted to present this slide to you, where you will see that extent to which, if you quantify, if you sum up all the economic and non-economic loss and damage being faced by the households, in case of non-migrant, on an average, every household is suffering close to 75% of the income loss because of climate impact. In case of migrant, close to 90% of the income is lost. But in case of displaced families, close to 184% of their income existing, they're suffering losses more than what they are earning. Now, if we were only studying non-migrant, even the situation of these group of households is precarious. They are like, imagine if a household is losing only all of their 75% of their income only on managing climate impacts, then that is a cause of worry. But in case of displaced families, it is increasing to 184%. And that is the reason why you will see a lot of them. How do they, when I presented this internally to the team, they said, how is this even possible? How can they have 184% loss? But yes, they are losing 184%. And the way they are coping with that is by selling off their land, selling off their cattle, assets, everything. And as they're losing, they're going deeper and deeper into the issue of distress and precarity. So, we can't just talk about the issues and not talk about solution. So we put in a lot of effort in also trying to understand what the solution would look like. Especially, we don't have to deal with the climate issue. We have to look at this whole issue as a compounding issue, as a multidimensional risk issue, and therefore the whole of that issue needs to be addressed. So one of the ways which has come out again and again in our consultation with the community is social protection. And social protection plays such an important role in helping communities not just tide or maintain their consumption level during crisis, but also recover from it more effectively. But the problem is, one, in itself, the social protection is very, very inadequate, as you have seen from the earlier findings. But more than that, we also need to provide whatever they are getting right now. It has to be more enhanced support in the time of crisis, and that should be provided to the extent possible in an anticipatory manner. So, we also carried out analysis, not just for Mali, but this is an analysis for all the fragile and conflict-affected states compared to those of other countries. So this is the kind of the scale of programs that the FCAS countries have. And, CCT, UCT is basically conditional cash transfer, universal cash transfer, and so on. So we can explain this in more detail if required. But the point is, you will see that generally the coverage of these programs is much less compared to those of other countries. And on an average, the FCAS countries spend as less as 0.8% of their GDP on social protection program, whereas this in the case of LDC is close to 1.83%, but in case of developed countries, on an average it is 17%, but in countries like Italy, France, it is as high as 45-50%. So you have to see that domestic resource mobilization in these countries around social protection is really low. But now let's look at how the existing social protection program really work in these countries. So the coverage is really low. The coverage is basically, if you understand, it's the ability of the program to reach the extreme poor. Benefit incidence is high because benefit incidence basically explain the extent to which non-poor people who should not be entitled to are excluded from the program is higher in case of FCAS. Adequacy, as I explained earlier, the investment is low, and therefore the adequacy is low, and average per capita transfer is low. But incidentally, if you look at the benefit cost ratio, the FCAS countries are much better in terms of achieving poverty or reducing poverty gap for every $1 of investment in social protection. So clearly, even though the adequacy is low or average per capita transfer is low, but if provided effect, and to mention, a lot of these social protection programs are also run by NGOs. So what we really need to do is to understand the current gaps in the social protection program and the opportunities, estimate the financial and the technical resources that would be needed to address those gaps, determine which stakeholders can contribute towards filling that gap, and then helping partners, because when we say financial resources, we'll also need money to be higher funding allocation to the social protection program. And clearly we are looking for climate finance. We are looking towards green climate fund or loss and damage fund. So we'll have to make a business case for investment in the social protection program as to how they can really help communities meet or tide over the climate crisis. And something that we looked at, like what would some of the solutions look like what would that gap filling look like in context of FCAS? Some of them were things like establishing early warning system, integrating climate vulnerabilities into the existing social protection registries, disaster risk financing instruments, for example, insurance pre-payout mechanism, collaborative and agile delivery network, strengthening local institutional capacity, addressing inequity and marginalization and exclusion issues in the delivery approach, and so on. So, I just don't want to show it as and of course, a lot of you know that this needs to be done, but we have not been able to do this yet for Mali, but I'm going to present this data for 8 other countries where we have done an assessment of what gap filling in these areas would look like. And this comes to be and we covered countries like Ghana, Malawi, Senegal, Uganda, Ethiopia, and so on. You look at this is the kind of investment which is needed in all of these countries together. But this is the real return on investment. So in 8 countries where we carried out the assessment, with an investment of $237 million, you can make $62 billion of investment that these countries are already doing in social protection program, also deliver climate resilience. So if you compare the benefit cost ratio, this is much, much higher. So that's the kind of investment we are looking for from the Loss and Damage Fund Board, Green Climate Fund, into the social protection program in countries like Mali. So I'm not going to take you through this because I'm sure our panelists will go through this in more detail. And then the last point I wanted to make in my presentation today is to promote locally led adaptation. Because what that would do is not just strengthen climate resilience, but would also help in dealing with the peace building effort. And we call, UNDP terms it as adaptive peace building effort. So and we identified some of the pathways through which this can be done. For example, addressing underlying vulnerability, for example, through livelihood diversification, small-scale enterprises, provision of financial services, especially for promoting sustainable agricultural practices. Then also strengthening social cohesion, which can really help in promoting trust, solidarity, collaboration, or promoting resilience and adaptive capacity. Again, in this third point, we can look towards social protection programs, especially the public works-based social protection program, can really go a long distance in creating this adaptive capacity. And then finally, some of the other pathways are enhancing legitimacy and trust in local institutions, promoting inclusive decision-making, and also preventing the recurrence of climate shocks. Of course, you can't stop climate impacts from happening, but you can prevent those shocks from impacting communities deeply by better preparedness and so on. So with that, I'll stop. And I'm sure Martin and others must have said that we'll be looking forward to more questions being raised because we have kept a lot of time aside for Q&A. But before we go into question and answer, I would want to turn towards our panelists today because they bring in both local perspective as well as the national and global perspective as well. So I'm very pleased to welcome 5 of our panelists. Mohammed Sissoko, who is from DanChurch, Mali. Abdul Aziz Al-Walil, who is from Tashat, who is our local partner. Abdi Hakim Ente, he is Director Climate Change and Food Security in the PM office in Somalia. We wanted to bring in more of a national perspective as how do countries, especially in FCAS context, really deal with some of these issues. We have Dr. Sinead Walsh, who is the Climate Director, Ireland Development of Foreign Affairs. And we have Alison Robert Shaw, who is the Head of Climate Justice at Comic Relief. So we really welcome all of those panelists. And because as we said, the theme of this panel discussion is local to global. So we'll probably start with local first. So I'll first turn to Mohammed and I'll ask him, because I know DCA, along with several other local civil society organization and NGO, has been implementing initiative in Mali for last several years. So what I would want to understand, and having worked on this in this research as well, is what support is DCA currently providing to communities which are facing this compounding impact of both climate and conflict? Where do you see the gaps? And how should national governments provide better support? But also, what kind of support you are expecting from international climate finance to come to the local level? So, Mohammed, over to you.
OK, merci Ritu pour cette brillante présentation. Je vais déjà activer voilà, la caméra pour permettre aux uns et aux autres de coller une image à ma voix. Voilà, donc au Mali, depuis un certain temps, depuis quelques années, on a des projets en cours qui impliquent le changement climatique, soit comme composante ou comme dimension transversale. On intervient essentiellement dans les régions centres, notamment Mopti, Badiangara et Douanza, et aussi un peu au nord, dans la région de Tombouctou. Dans notre démarche, nous évoluons à travers d'abord une évaluation de la vulnérabilité climatique des communautés pour un peu planifier des actions appropriées en réponse aux contraintes communautaires. Comme action que nous mettons en œuvre au Mali, c'est des renforcements des capacités sur les techniques d'adaptation au changement climatique. Il y a aussi des soutiens aux moins des substances résilients pour notamment les jeunes et les femmes. Toujours dans la perspective des réponses aux effets du changement climatique, nous apportons des soutiens aussi aux mécanismes locaux de gestion des ressources naturelles, des renforcements aussi des capacités de communauté pour l'accès à l'eau, parce que, comme vous le savez, l'accès à l'eau devient aussi assez critique dans le contexte du Mali, qui est quand même un pays assez vulnérable aux effets du changement climatique. Donc, nous aménageons des infrastructures hydrauliques pour faciliter non seulement l'accès à l'eau potable, mais aussi soutenir les modes de subsistance des communautés, notamment pour l'agriculture et aussi l'élevage. Toujours dans la perspective, nous apportons des soutiens aux initiatives communautaires pour répondre aux pertes de dommages climatiques, des pertes économiques et non économiques évidemment. Et ces initiatives sont généralement issues des plans d'action communautaires pour apporter des réponses aux pertes et dommages climatiques identifiés au sein des communautés. Il y a aussi des assistances directes qu'on apporte à des populations, à nos bénéficiaires au niveau d'un certain nombre de villages bénéficiaires. Ça, c'est en lien surtout avec un projet que nous avons sur les pertes et dommages climatiques qui inclut déjà cette évaluation-là. Ça, c'est un peu les actions que nous mettons en œuvre globalement au Mali. Donc, pour résumer, il s'agit des renforcements des capacités, des soutiens aux moins des substances, des assistances économiques directes aux communautés, et aussi des soutiens aux initiatives communautaires de réponse aux pertes et dommages climatiques, essentiellement pour la restauration des zones de pâturage, des activités de reboisement, et aussi des réhabilitations des points d'eau, des récupérations des sols dégradés pour la restauration des sols. Voilà, donc ce sont les quelques actions que nous mettons en œuvre ici sur les différents projets qui sont financés jusqu'ici par DANIDA et la République fédérale d'Allemagne. Donc, ce sont les deux bailleurs qui nous financent sur ces projets de réponse aux effets du changement climatique. Maintenant, par rapport aux difficultés, nous en avons quelques-unes, mais qui sont quand même des détails, parce que, comme on le dit, l'argent étant le nerf de la guerre, nous avons des difficultés des ressources financières, bien entendu, parce que c'est des projets qui ont des financements limités par rapport déjà aux enjeux que nous traversons. C'est un peu comme on le dit, un combat de David contre Goliath, parce que le Mali était quand même très vulnérable et les besoins sont vraiment aigus par rapport aux ressources que nous disposons. Mais on ne désespère pas parce que c'est quand même une question de vie. Voilà, parce que les questions climatiques aujourd'hui, c'est vraiment une question de vie. Donc, on évolue avec les ressources et en partenariat avec les services étatiques qui aussi, malheureusement, sont en difficulté au plan financier et matériel parce qu'on travaille en tandem. Malgré leur volonté, malgré tous les efforts qu'ils fournissent à nos côtés, il y a des difficultés quand même à pouvoir les rendre beaucoup plus opérationnels pour répondre à leur rôle, pour jouer leur rôle régalien. Et ça également, c'est une difficulté. Comme difficulté, il y a l'accès à nos zones d'intervention, parce que comme vous le savez, le Mali traverse une crise quand même depuis 2012. Ce qui implique un peu des contraintes d'accès à nos zones d'intervention liées à l'insécurité. Cela implique donc des limitations d'accès à des personnes qui sont vulnérables, qui sont beaucoup plus dans une situation de vulnérabilité qui nécessite notre appui. Mais malheureusement, notre intervention est limitée dans certaines zones à cause de la situation d'insécurité que nous traversons. Voilà les quelques contraintes que nous connaissons. Bon, en réponse, je pense que, comme on le dit le plus souvent, une difficulté liée à l'accès au financement n'a d'autre réponse que le financement. Voilà, donc la réponse serait de renforcer la mobilisation des ressources financières pour apporter plus de soutien à ces communautés-là, des financements climatiques, pour un peu accompagner les efforts non seulement d'atténuation, mais aussi d'adaptation et des réponses aux pertes et dommages, parce que de plus en plus on rencontre des phénomènes climatiques extrêmes qui compliquent encore la situation et qui malheureusement est associé à des conflits communautaires et à l'insécurité, voilà, qui constitue quand même un facteur aggravant de la situation de vulnérabilité. Il y a comme solution qu'on pourra imaginer, c'est le renforcement des capacités des services et des agences de l'État pour les rendre beaucoup plus opérationnels afin de répondre afin de jouer leur rôle régalien et aussi de contribuer à la mise en œuvre des stratégies et des politiques de l'État en matière de climat, notamment la mise en œuvre du plan national d'adaptation, de la politique d'adaptation au changement climatique, et aussi les contributions déterminées au niveau national, les CDN. Et ça, on ne pourra pas le faire sans évidemment avoir des ressources financières pour accompagner non seulement l'État, mais aussi les communautés. Voilà en quelques mots ce que je voulais dire sur le Mali. S'il y a des questions, s'il y a voilà, des choses qui ne sont pas encore claires, je suis disponible pour apporter beaucoup plus de détails. Merci à tous.
Thank you, Mohammed. Really nice to hear how you are currently dealing with some of the issues and barriers at the ground level, and the kind of support you are expecting from both the national as well as global stakeholders. But I just wanted to acknowledge that we have Ministry of Environment representation from Mali in today's audience. So we would really encourage, sir, that you please, if you have any input or if you have any comments, suggestions, we'll be very keen to engage with you. But I'll move on to Abdul Aziz Al-Walid, who's the national coordinator at the SHART. Their support was really invaluable. Like, it was very, very helpful for us in carrying out that kind of grounded research that we really need in an initiative like this. So what I would want to understand from the SHART is, because we know one of the biggest impact of climate so far has been on displacement and distress migration. So what we wanted to understand from them is, how are they currently supporting displaced and vulnerable communities in Mopti? And what challenges do they think are still remaining and could be and that would enable them better support these communities if they are provided with better resources and support? So do we have Abdul?
Abdul, il vient d'arriver. Il vient d'arriver parce que il n'était pas prévu qu'il prenne part au test. Voilà, on avait annoncé 11 heures pour le démarrage de la rencontre. Il vient d'arriver, mais je pense qu'il a un peu compris la question. Abdul?
Oui, la question,
la question, c'est la situation, c'est ce qu'on peut faire pour la migration liée notamment au conflit et au phénomène climatique, au changement climatique, aux effets du changement climatique.
And what support is needed in case, yeah.
Ouais, vous pouvez venir ici. Il va s'approcher de moi pour donner des détails.
Ok, bonjour, moi c'est Abdulaziz Agadouali, coordinateur national de TASAC. En fait, bon, moi j'étais prévu pour 11h, donc je viens d'arriver, heureusement que je suis arrivé quelques minutes avant. Et maintenant, la question, si j'ai bien compris, la question avec laquelle je coïncidais quand j'ai rentré en salle, justement, que vous venez de répéter, c'est qu'est-ce qu'il faut faire pour les réfugiés climatiques, c'est ça?
Les déplacés.
Oui, les déplacés climatiques, réfugiés, tout ça. Bon, je pense encore une fois que il y a toute une gamme graduée des mesures d'accompagnement de l'ensemble des déplacés et réfugiés climatiques. Donc, la réponse, elle n'est pas standard, elle est de mon point de vue graduée. Graduée en ce sens qu'il y a les mesures d'urgence, il y a les mesures sur les moyens et les long terme. Donc, c'est ça l'approche graduée qu'il essaie de développer en réponse à la détresse de toutes ces communautés déplacées du fait des changements climatiques. Alors, les réponses immédiates, donc, qui se classent aussi dans les bateaux de l'humanitaire, c'est que c'est des communautés qui sont véritablement en détresse et qui perdent subitement, qui se retrouvent subitement en train de perdre leurs moyens de production. Et les moyens de production, ils vont des terres dégradées aux richesses telles que les animaux et plein d'autres qui sont affectés par justement ces changements, les effets de ces changements climatiques. Alors là, ce qu'il faut faire, c'est qu'il est classé dans le cadre humanitaire parce que c'est tout de suite des communautés en détresse qu'il faut aider à avoir des points de chute et à développer des mécanismes immédiats de survie. Bon, c'est un instinct de survie en ce sens. Je prends l'exemple, par exemple, d'une communauté qui se retrouve, d'un village qui se retrouve subitement par l'effet d'inondations ou de pluies torrentielles ou des sécheresses à perdre l'ensemble de sa production agricole. Alors, auquel cas, il faut d'abord, le premier réflexe, c'est d'aider les gens à trouver, si je puis m'exprimer terre à terre, de trouver à manger. Pour ceux qui, par exemple, ceux des éleveurs agro-pasteurs, etc., qui se retrouvent du jour au lendemain dans un cycle de sécheresse assez sévère, autrement dit, qui perdent toute possibilité de faire paître leurs animaux ou de nourrir simplement leurs animaux. Là, ils se déplacent. Également, à ceci, il faut les aider justement dans le cadre justement de la résilience de leur noyau de reproduction, autrement dit une assistance immédiate en termes d'apport en alimentation de leurs animaux et à eux-mêmes. Parce que tout de suite, la conséquence qui s'ensuit, c'est qu'en plus de l'affectation physique des animaux, ils perdent en valeur. Ils perdent en valeur et subitement, ça se répercute sur les ménages qui manquent toute ressource aidant un peu à développer, disons, à se prendre en charge tout simplement. Donc maintenant, si les moyens et long terme, ce qu'il faut faire, c'est que ces mécanismes, ils sont assez divers. Disons, les effets de ces changements climatiques qui sont assez divers et variés selon les zones, selon les types d'activités. Alors, ce qu'il faut faire, c'est qu'il faut accompagner, selon les zones et selon les types d'activités, les producteurs à développer des mécanismes de prévention et de résilience. Prévention, par exemple, si je prends le cas des agriculteurs, il faut tout de suite les amener à réfléchir sur un peu les aménagements ou les outils qui peuvent les aider à amoindrir, à atténuer les conséquences de ces changements climatiques. Je prends l'exemple des inondations. Il y a des mécanismes assez pratiques par lesquels on peut lutter contre les conséquences de ces inondations ou les prévenir ou les atténuer. Et je prends le cas des agro-pasteurs. Là également, on peut, par d'autres mécanismes, en moyen et long terme, créer des alternatives en termes de production de fourrage, en termes de gestion des troupeaux, qui peuvent aider à atténuer les effets de ces changements climatiques en termes de pertes et de dommages. Donc voilà, pris à chaud, ce que j'ai, ma contribution en fait.
Ritu, je voulais ajouter quelque chose que je n'avais pas dit dans les solutions. Je pense qu'il y a l'analyse aussi de la sensibilité au conflit qu'il faudra intégrer dans l'action climatique, parce que le plus souvent, tous les efforts que nous mettons en œuvre sont presque annihilés par des conflits communautaires récurrents. Donc, ce serait important peut-être de prendre cette dimension-là en compte, l'analyse systématique de la sensibilité au conflit dans l'action climatique. Et aussi la mise en place des mécanismes de gestion collaborative des ressources naturelles, parce que les conflits parfois sont associés aussi à la gestion des ressources naturelles. C'est vrai, nous sommes en train de le faire au Mali, mais je pense que c'est une pratique qui doit être renforcée, notamment la sensibilité au conflit et la gestion collaborative des ressources naturelles. Sinon, on sera dans un schéma d'un éternel recommencement, et c'est de nature à ne pas peut-être assurer la durabilité de nos interventions. Je pense que Aziz a parlé d'un point aussi important qui est relatif à la gestion des catastrophes. Je pense que c'est très important aussi parce que un exemple concret, on intervient par exemple dans le cadre de ces projets-là dans un village où après avoir mené des actions en réponse aux pertes de dommages climatiques, le village a connu une inondation qui a carrément détruit les champs de culture. Plusieurs dizaines d'hectares de terres cultivables ont été détruits. Donc, ça veut dire que cette dimension-là aussi doit être prise en compte si on veut aussi renforcer les acquis et pérenniser nos interventions.
Non, non, je pense aussi, à l'instar de Sissoko, que la dimension prévention-gestion des conflits est très pertinente. Il faut agir avec les Dunohan parce que le plus souvent, se déplacer, ils vont vers d'autres zones. Ils vont vers des zones qui sont justement occupées par d'autres communautés. Alors, la cohabitation entre les deux exerce une véritable pression sur les ressources disponibles. Et du coup, pour l'accès, le contrôle de ces ressources, et bon, on a des tensions, on a des clivages, et on trouve chaque fois que l'eau est dans les gaz, quoi. Alors là, il faut les prévenir en allant justement avec l'approche de no harm. Aussi, un élément que moi j'ai toujours répété depuis qu'on a initié ce projet pertes et dommages et toutes les occasions que j'ai d'en parler, c'est qu'on a véritablement besoin, au niveau de nos communautés, de sensibiliser d'abord sur le concept des changements climatiques, parce que le fatalisme fait que les communautés n'arrivent pas à s'approprier justement cette question des changements climatiques. On pense que c'est fait de Dieu, ça va passer, c'est ceci, c'est cela, Dieu. Bon, Dieu nous a créés tous, il a créé les terres, les planètes, etc. Mais quand même, les changements climatiques, c'est un fait qui a scientifiquement des cheminements. Donc, il faut amener les communautés justement à comprendre que les changements climatiques, ce n'est pas un fait de hasard, ce n'est pas du fatalisme. Je pense que c'est la première des choses que l'on doit faire. En ce moment, on aura beaucoup plus d'adhésion, beaucoup plus d'appropriation de l'approche.
Thank you so much, Mohammed and Sissoko, as well as Abdulaziz. You brought to the table some very important point. One is prevention, and prevention by the way of building flood relief or flood measures or flood resilience and drought resilience measures and so on, so that communities are less exposed to some of those impacts. But also some of the anticipatory action which we came out based on the community level consultation as well. And you also raised this point that, you know, climate impacts cannot just be seen in isolation. It has to be seen in combination with a whole lot of other impacts that community is facing, especially conflict. So climate conflict risks have to be dealt with in tandem, along with some of the development deficits that communities are already facing. So all your points well taken, and I hope the kind of recommendations we've come out with, especially looking at locally led adaptation, leading to adaptive peace building effort, is something that we'll need to work towards and make sure that we have enough resources and support behind that, both from the national government as well as support internationally in terms of financing. So I'll move on to Abdi Hakim Einte, who's the director. I hope, Abdi, are you there? Are you online?
Indeed, I am here. Yeah.
Okay, thanks, Abdi. So I wanted to understand, because see, you are from Somalia and you're working with Prime Minister's office, and you must have heard the findings that you've come out from Mali. I'm sure many of those findings must have resonated with you as well. And something which we've been discussing a lot is this issue of investment in social protection or food security, how that is really low. I presented that figure like, you know, it's less than 1%. But why is it really that case when you know that social protection can really help build that protective aspect around the communities exposed to this crisis? But why is government not able to invest enough in these measures? So Would be interesting in hearing your thoughts about it and what can be done to address all those issues.
I mean, first of all, thank you so much, Ritu, and I'm so happy to hear our colleagues from Mali and the report, which I'm looking forward to read it. It's always very refreshing when you read countries that you have as similarities, and sometimes it's in the same setting up, such as Mali and Somalia. I think the question that you raised and from the previous colleagues who are speaking here, I think it really resonates a lot in Somalia. I think there are a couple of things that we need to understand here. Number one is that, state institutions are very much constrained by a number of factors, including the ability, first of all, to provide the basic services, but also the ability to generate a sufficient and adequate response to adequate resources and response to the crisis that we are facing. And thirdly is because of the, sometimes and too often more than not, is because of the development fundings or the development partners, they tend to operate and work in a largely silos and sometimes duplicitous approach to the country. So when you put all those factors into a context, you will have a country that is heavily constrained by serious limitations. And unless we unshackle ourselves from those limitations, it'll be very difficult for us to really clear the path and for us to also feed into our people. So in this context, I would like to highlight a couple of things. Number one, I think Somalia does share some similarities with Mali in terms of the overall socio-economic structure. Both of us are really struggling with persistent conflict that are stemming from either armed groups, communal conflict, and in many respects, non-state actors who are really threatening the core fabric of the society, such as Boko Haram there and here in Al-Shabaab. What they are doing, both these non-armed state actors, is threatening the core fabric of the government, such as our security, our governance structures. Therefore, our ability then have become completely constrained. Thus, our ability to respond sometimes becomes very limited. Then, in this context, then also, you have this natural and cyclical crises that are often posed by climate, natural causes such as climate. And the climate, I think, as I've said too often, it does not cause the state does not cause, it's not the primary cause of the hunger and the lack of food, the malnutrition, and so on. I think climate is a sort of a net result that came out from the state's capacity to respond and generate resources and response to its own crisis. Therefore, climate has become a force of multiplier in a context where the state has a very limited capacity. And I think it truly speaks to Mali, it speaks to Somalia, in any other countries. And then when the climate becomes a force of multiplier, then it creates a cascading impact, right? It further erodes our vulnerability that A, we cannot feed our people, B, we cannot provide all those social protection measures that are required, and thirdly, we don't have enough or adequate resources because of we cannot generate our resources. There's no domestic revenue and there's no other resources that we can do. Therefore, we are now become a vulnerable. Vulnerability in many senses does not necessarily mean that we are vulnerable to shocks, but we're also vulnerable because our ability to respond, and in every community, every society around the world, wherever they are, there are shocks, there are climate shocks, and how they come out of the shocks very much depends on their social institutions, whether their institutions have the ability and the capacity to respond. And I think in this case, those countries that are heavily impacted by conflict and climate have further eroded, and they have slipped off from the basic norms of state functions. So therefore, they become an exemplified, or sort of they become the quintessential of what happens when a state does not have the ability to respond, but also natural shocks happen, or also unnatural shocks such as conflicts happen, and the result will be catastrophic. Now, I don't want to dwell too much on the context and the problem, because most of us, we understand. The question is, how can we come out this? I mean, what can we do to address this persistent, prolonged situation that are really putting our countries at a stage of vulnerability? I think there are a couple of things that needs to happen. First of all, strengthening institutions, especially indigenous institutions, local institutions, that has the ability. We have cases where when countries respond to their crisis, then they can improve. But when we try to outsource our problem to externals, then that will be a major problem. Secondly, I think it's very important that we also have to understand what are the best practices, what works for us, what are the best practices that we need to build on, so that we put strong protective measures, whether they are mitigatory measures or other adaptation measures. Depends on the context and the situation. I think each country have their own coping mechanisms to withstand whatever shocks that comes. In the case of Somalia, I think we have now a government that is gradually expanding its scope of legitimacy and capacity to deliver. I mean, 3 years, 4 years ago, our ability to forewarn early warnings was very limited, but now we're working closely with the private sectors. We're working with our largest private telco in the country, and we are putting all the ringtones of the local phone calls. Whenever you make a phone call to someone in Somalia, we use the ringtone rather than having a normal ringtones. We put a local content that promotes that sensitizes and educates the local community, so that they better aware and understand how to respond and to work with it. So we're expanding our scope of capacity and operation. That's number two. Thirdly, I think the question of resources comes here very important. And as you know, Ritu, we are countries that are heavily burdened by debt, external debt, and we are economically distressed. I mean, our financial institutions are very much limited by this depressing debt distress, and we are left with almost virtually to ask for grants. And you know what grant is does, and you cannot rely on few grants unless you have a mega project. So we need to also improve our debt sustainability, so that we have a strong financial system that can be trusted and that can be invested. And that cannot happen unless we fundamentally challenge the global financial architecture, or the so-called global financial compact, that is so rigid and very difficult, and that's disproportionately put us at disadvantage for countries that are going through the IFCAS challenges. So we also need to keep in mind. So I think the voices from Mali and the voices from Somalia and other countries are very much important in this conversation, because we believe when we put our voices together, when we share our lessons together, then we can really make a voice, and this voice ultimately could make a change in the decision making wherever they are, whether they are in IMFs or World Bank or the global institutions. So I stop here, and I really appreciate you, Ritu, for inviting me, and your colleagues for the good paper. And by the way, we have a similar paper that are coming, and hopefully we'll have a similar roundtable, hopefully, and we will invite our colleagues from Mali to also join when we'll have our roundtable for our paper, and other colleagues that are present in the group. So over to you, Ritu.
Thank you so much, Abdi. It's always a pleasure to hear you, especially because you bring the points to the fore very clearly, explaining the root cause of many. Because we do understand that in FCAS context, governance is a challenge, but what really drives the governance challenge, that you very clearly explained. But of course, you also hinted towards the point of reforming the international financial architecture, bringing in better resources, issue of debt sustainability. These are all mega big global issues and challenges. So I have to turn onto Dr. Sinead Walsh, who is the climate director from Ireland's Department for Foreign Affairs. And Sinead has been very closely associated with some of the discussions around fund for responding to loss and damage. So we would really want to understand from you, Sinead, as to how can the mechanisms like Fund for Responding to Loss and Damage be made more accessible to countries like Mali and Somalia and so on, and especially because we did an analysis of the GCF fund, and what we found that only one third of the global climate finance from GCF is actually going into FCAS countries which are by far one of the most vulnerable, even more vulnerable than LDCs. So and also the second question to you is, what can donors do differently to better support conflict-affected settings? And this I'm saying especially because Ireland is one of the few countries which actually has prioritized the issues of FCAS countries. So be interested to hear your perspective on these 2 points.
Thanks, Ritu, and it's good to be here, and it's good to have heard from colleagues from Mali and also Somalia, as well as obviously the detail on the report. I mean, I think the first thing I would say on the Fund for Loss and Damage, and indeed how any of these global funds can be helpful for fragile and conflict-affected countries, is that I think naturally they won't be. So I think they will always need a special effort, because even if in theory, these funds are open to all countries, there will always be kind of, security reasons why people can't travel, why, you can't have staff there or have consultants visit. And, so unless there's a special way for the funds to engage, I think you can more or less count on it that these kind of countries will end up getting neglected. Also because, in some conflict-affected countries, of course, you're looking at areas beyond state control, and the UNFCCC system is very much based on states and governments. So it can be quite tricky. So I suppose I would just say there does need to be special kind of provisions made, and it was encouraging to see that the GCF executive director visited Somalia, for example, because that fund hasn't tended to be all that strong on those sorts of countries. So I think on the Loss and Damage Fund, Ireland is on the board. This is a big priority for Ireland, as you said. Ritu, we're sharing a seat with the European Commission on the board. And I think, I suppose, maybe more tangibly even at the moment, is something I would highlight with respect to provisions for LDCs and SIDS. And we know that, there's some LDCs that are also the FCAS grouping. So we worked very hard in Ireland, along with LDCs and SIDS, to get an agreement that they have a special allocation in the fund. And now, it may be next week's board meeting, or it may be the following one, but over the next few months, the board will have to decide what percentage is that special allocation for LDCs and SIDS. So I would just sort of draw people's attention to that. We need to make sure that that is a high percentage, both for those who are conflict affected and those who are not. I think that's really important. We've actually been trying to, as the fund has been kind of coming up with its own startup phase proposals, we made a submission with the European Commission about highlighting the priority of making sure that fragile and conflict affected contexts are accounted for. And at the moment, the updated proposal from the fund, which is available on their website, does say that there will be differentiated approaches for fragile and conflict affected settings. But again, I think we all need to sort of follow up very much on this, including the fragile and conflict countries themselves, to make sure that this really happens. So I think making those interventions through the countries that are on the board for this LDCs and SIDS allocation, and also for the special approaches, I think will be really important. And maybe the last thing I want to say about the fund, before I maybe talk about donors more broadly, I think links a little bit into what I was seeing a little bit in the chat, but also hearing from the colleagues from Mali, which is this point about how loss and damage is one point on a very broad spectrum between humanitarian, from sort of humanitarian to development work, and increasingly this area of how this is affected by climate change. So I think Abdi from Somalia made the point that a lot of donors work in silos, and so do a lot of NGOs sometimes. So I think we all need to be much more sort of agile, I guess, working across, and this would apply to the fund on loss and damage, that we work across that nexus of where humanitarian, climate and development and indeed conflict all comes together, rather than trying to say that we can have this category for loss and damage, we can have this category for adaptation. We know that in real life these things are much more mixed, so we need to be working on, especially now with a lot of funding cuts, we need to be working on these issues all together. And maybe just to finish off, Ritu, you had asked about how what donors can do differently in terms of FCAS. I mean, I suppose the first thing that I would say on that is that we always really call for a special focus on conflict-affected countries. We think the term fragile can be a bit woolly, that if you focus too much on fragile countries, you can find that the conflict-affected countries kind of get marginalized. So we need to be really clear that the biggest gap is for conflict-affected countries, and the statistics bear that out in terms of who gets climate finance. So I saw some statistics about in fragile states, climate finance is about $5 per person per year, but it's $2 per person per year in conflict-affected states. So I think let's also be clear on what we're talking about here, and that there's a lot of vulnerability out there, but really the absolute most vulnerable is the kind of conflict-affected states that we're talking about today. And sometimes we need to separate those categories. We've actually been supporting a new network of ministers for fragile and conflict-affected countries, and I suppose that is really to put the voices of ministers from those countries in more prominence, to be able to call for their own special needs. So the network met for the first time in Abu Dhabi. I think it was at the beginning of March, and we were supporting that. So we're keen to help to amplify those voices and the same kind of voices that we've heard today. We also supported a very interesting workshop just the week before last in Geneva, and that was looking at areas outside state control. And I think we think this is a really important area as well. As I said earlier, often areas outside state control, because of conflict, can have some incredibly vulnerable populations. And how do we deal with that? It's really, really difficult to deal with that. But I think it was a very good workshop, and it tried to pull together different evidence and good practice on this, and tried to make some recommendations. And we noticed actually there was some good similarity in the findings between that workshop and the paper that you presented today, Ritu. And it is solutions like locally led adaptation, which I think we can all agree is particularly appropriate in conflict-affected settings. It is also ways in which we can bring together, peacemaking, mediation with climate action. I just wanted to mention one example that we are funding International Alert, which is an NGO to work in conflict-affected parts of Kenya and Nigeria, bringing communities who are, in conflict with each other, bringing them together around climate adaptation projects in order to try and use that as an entry point for peace building and confidence building measures. So I thought that might be of interest today. And then I think the last point is about, how do we really push particularly the international, it's a little bit coming back to where I started from, how do we incentivize the international financial architecture and funds and so on to work in these settings? And there is, often a real reluctance to work in conflict-affected settings for obvious reasons. But I think we need to put across the point about urgency, and we need to, kind of really show that, we shouldn't avoid activities in conflict-affected settings. Sometimes people think, oh, well, if you're working in those places, you're giving money to belligerents, but we need to be making a strong case that is not what we're doing, and that the needs are actually really widespread and urgent, and often these are really the most vulnerable people that we're dealing with. So from an Irish perspective, we're as you say, Ritu, it's a big priority for us. How do we reach these communities, and we'll continue to do that, and I would be quite interested in seeing how some of the findings from the report, particularly, things like, having quantitative evidence of the leveraging, which I think you were talking about, of how social protection finance can be leveraged to much greater amounts in these settings. So I think these are some of the ways in which we can feed into broader discussions, including with respect to the Loss and Damage Fund. So thanks a lot. Good to be here today.
Thank you so much. In fact, we are confident that with voices like yours, influencing fund for responding to loss and damage in not direct, of course, I know you are there through the European Union, but that's the kind of support that we really need for FCAS in the way discussions proceed in FRLD. And we'll be very keen to engage with you, Sinead. One, on the findings of Mali, but as you know, we are working with Somalia and a couple of other fragile contexts as well, especially as you talked about the network of ministers and other initiatives which promote things around locally led adaptation in fragile contexts. So very keen. And we would also be keen to engage with IIED and European Union in general, again, on especially what Abdi mentioned around the reform of international financial architecture, especially in a way, because we all agree it's not just climate per se, which is creating the issue. It is a compounding issue. That's why we developed that 3P framework. There are a lot of predisposing factors, precipitating and protective. So like a lot of those predisposing factors are there, those socioeconomic vulnerabilities are there because they don't have access to development finance and so on. So we would be very keen to engage to understand some of the issues around debt sustainability itself, which inhibits countries' ability to raise domestic resources around social protection, for example, or even for adaptation as such. So we'll be very keen to engage with you and Ireland in general, and use your voice to leverage on broader European Union support on some of these issues.